So moving on to the next slide, what you need to know about slide security. First, there's no free lunch. If you have application vulnerabilities in your data center, they will also be application vulnerabilities in the cloud. And I'm talking about application vulnerabilities such as cross-site scripting, injection flaws, malicious file execution, and so forth. These types of things may invite greater visibility and therefore greater vulnerability by being in the cloud. So you need to take care of business with regard to application vulnerabilities if you're considering moving internal applications into the cloud. The developer access to production systems is a potential vulnerability, whether it's inside your data center or it's in the cloud. Privileged users and developers represent potential vulnerabilities in your data center and in the cloud. And this is something that you really need to look into, because these privileged users, unlike for applications you have in your data center, are people that you don't know. So I looked at one cloud provider, Amazon Web Service, in terms of how they deal with privileged users and admins. They have comprehensive physical and logical controls, and I'll just read a list. It includes video surveillance, state-of-the-art intrusion detection systems. Authorized staff must pass two-factor authentication at least twice. Immediate deprovisioning of admin when no longer business need. Extensive background check. All admin access logged and audited, both physical and logical. Firewall requires customer X509 certificate and key to authorize changes, and so forth. So you can look at these and compare to your own process and procedures for your admins. Most of the people I talk to say that this goes beyond what they do, and it helps to alleviate the concern they have about the potential vulnerability. Going to the next slide, what you need to know about cloud security. If you consider the apps being migrated to the cloud, what are their security and compliance requirements? So you need to start from the point of view of understanding requirements and working from there. Not all clouds are created equal. Not all requirements are equal. And so you need to try and find alignment between what your requirements are and what the various cloud vendors offer. Whatever your vulnerabilities are, the cloud providers, privileged admins, as we just discussed, represent potential incremental exposure than what you have today. So make this an area of focus. And this case in particular is something that you've always had to deal with for any type of outsourced or managed service. And then get educated about cloud provider security to ensure alignment with your requirements in terms of contractual SLAs. So, for example, what should we put in the agreement? What kind of SLAs? Well, liability for data breach, requirement for third-party risk assessment, patch management strategy and metrics. You want to know what their time frames are. Business continuity and disaster recovery performance, incident response and notification, and then just understand where your data is located, how it's copied, how it's backed up. And this is particularly important for various compliance requirements.
Robbie, let me butt in again for a second. I've talked to a couple of cloud computing service providers, and their goal, they say, gee, the end user shouldn't care where the data is. And I've got some real concerns about that. What are your thoughts?
Well, from a programmatic and logical point of view, they don't need to know where it is. And I know the cloud providers would like to think they shouldn't care, but there are certain compliance requirements. For example, PCI requires that an auditor to be able to go physically view where your data is located in order to judge the security parameters are in place. And if the cloud provider won't tell you or doesn't know, then that presents a problem the way the PCI compliance spec is written today. So that's just one example. Is that a legitimate and valid compliance requirement? Well, there are a lot of people that think so. If you don't know where your data is, then you might not be in control of it.
Right. I mean, I have those concerns. I don't mean to take us afield. I'll mention another concern. Gee, there's a company that's doing business mainly in New England, and their cloud computing provider starts to move their data to China because their costs are less over there. There'll be, the compliance issues you mentioned. There could be performance issues. So I'm a little bit concerned with this. Don't worry, be happy. It's all in the cloud.
I would be very concerned with that. The provider that I'm most familiar with, Amazon Web Services, you can specify regional jurisdiction requirements so that if you have personal identifiable information, for example, that needs to remain in the U.S., and they can verify that it will stay within that region. What they can't do is verify that it will stay within a particular data center or even in a state. But in general, there are no compliance requirements that I'm aware of for which that would be a problem. So moving on to the slide, security questions for your cloud vendor. Gartner put together a paper in June 2008 called Assessing the Security Risks of Cloud Computing. And again, in the spirit of putting the tools in an enterprise hands so they can go evaluate security requirements, they list 7 specific security issues. The first one, privileged user access. As I've discussed in the last couple of slides, I believe this is the top issue. In theory, once it's sent into the cloud, your data should be accessible by admins, that is, privileged users, that you've never seen or vetted. So what kind of protections can you apply to your data, such as encryption and access control lists? What kind of screening and background checks are performed for admins? How comprehensive are the site's physical controls? So these are the types of questions that you would want to ask to understand, have they going above and beyond in terms of the security around their privileged users because they're outside of your visibility and they're outside of your control. Second, regulatory compliance. So we've just alluded to that a little bit, but what type of a compliance does the cloud provider themselves have? For example, SAS 70 Type 2 certification is a pretty tight spec. You might ask your cloud provider if that's been achieved. Sarbanes-Oxley is another, and if your cloud provider is a public company, they will have that. And then what kind of support do they provide for your certification requirements such as PCI DSS and HIPAA? Third is data location. Some compliance standards require that certain data not leave the current regional or national jurisdiction. Again, we just talked about that. There are some cloud providers that will certify that, and obviously there are some who won't. Data segregation. Is data segregated at rest? Is it encrypted at rest? Recovery, make sure, understand, and evaluate their disaster recovery and business continuity strategies. An earthquake, flood, pandemic that devastates your cloud-based applications is an unacceptable risk for most enterprises. Investigative support. You need to have access to archive data that may be required for litigation support, discovery requests, or illegal activity investigation. You need to make sure your cloud provider can support those requirements. And finally, long-term viability. If your cloud provider goes out of business, you need to make sure you have access to your critical resources stored in that provider's now defunct data center, or you need to make sure you're working with a provider who's not going to go out of business. So it's a good list. I think it's a good framework for evaluating cloud providers. And this was written last summer, but Gartner predicted that by next year, confusion around the cloud will have been replaced with clean slate competitors delivering and consuming services from search to identity to core infrastructure operations. And what that means to me is you should be in the ability as you should have the ability as these terms and capabilities get kind of normalized to take an RFP approach now to cloud providers and end up with a capabilities matrix for evaluating cloud provider security capabilities versus your own requirements.
Robbie, just a quick comment. Steve mentioned we're in the middle of doing some research into cloud computing, and the results we have are, somewhat preliminary, but they certainly do indicate significant interest on a going forward basis on the use of cloud computing in general, but SAS in particular.